Which frame rate should I be shooting in and what difference does it make? There are all these options in my camera, but why? Can I mix different frame rates in one video? Okay, so first let me explain what exactly frame rate is. So it's basically the amount of still images that's squeezed into a 1 second clip. So when you record a video and you set your frame rate to, let's say, 24 frames per second, then the camera will capture 24 frames for every second you're recording, and therefore displaying a movement to your eyes. Let me see if I understand it correctly. So what you're saying is if I want a 5 second clip on the 24 frame per second timeline, then 24 times 5 equals 120. So if I take 120 pictures of a sequence and then I turn it into a 5 second clip, then it will look like a film, or look like a movie I actually recorded. Is that right? You know what? Let's just do exactly that. We'll take 120 pictures and turn it into a 5 second clip. So in the exact same way, when you record a video, your camera will record 25, 30, 60, 120 or 240 frames for every second you're recording. Okay, so how does slow motion comes into the picture? So when you record a higher frame rate, like 120 frames per second, then you have 120 frames for every second you record. And if you put that into a 24 frame per second timeline, then you get 5 second clip out of a 1 second 120 frame. You get 5 seconds at 24 frame per second. So let's see what happens if you don't follow this rule and you're trying to slow down a 24 frame per second footage like this to half of its speed. This is how it looks like. To half of its speed. This is how it looks like. Oh my god. Okay, so what's the story with 23.97? 24, 25, 30 frames per second. Why do we have so many options and what's the difference between them? To answer this question, we have to start with the basics. There are two major color encoding systems in the world called NTSC and PAL. NTSC delivers a 30 frames per second frame rate and it's standard in the US and Japan. And the rest of the world, including Europe and Australia, have PAL, which uses 25 frames per second. These two systems also have different picture and color quality, but we're only concentrating on frame rates here. In the past, on analog TVs, you were only able to play one or the other format, but that is not the case anymore. Modern digital TVs have no issues displaying different frame rates while they're receiving a digital signal. Using an analog connection would be a different story, of course. But let's say you're recording a YouTube video like this at 24, 25, 30 or even 60 frames per second. It can still be uploaded and watched regardless of your locations without any issues. So can I just pick one and go with it? No problem? It's going to work, you say? Yes, it will work and you can pick any frame rate, but there's one major difference you should consider. Different countries have different power sources. For example, in the US, electrical outlets operate at 60 Hz. Meanwhile, in Europe, it is 50 Hz. So when it comes to indoor light sources, a 60 Hz outlet in the US means a light bulb gets electricity turned on and off 60 times per second, which means to your eyes, it seems like a continuous light, but if you're trying to record a video in the US at 25 frames per second, it cannot sync to a 60 Hz light bulb. 30 can, because it's exactly a half of it. The results will be flickering lights. In the same way, if you're in Europe and you're trying to record indoor at 30 frames per second, you're going to get flickers. This is why, if you want to keep it simple and flicker free, then make sure to shoot 30 in the US and 25 frames per second in Europe and pretty much the rest of the world. Now, setting the correct frame rate is not the only way to get rid of flickering. There are a couple of other things you can do to avoid it. One, you can use natural light sources like the sun, or a high frequency light designed for video production. If it's not an option, you can always change the shutter speed to get rid of the flicker. Now remember, lowering the shutter speed will increase motion blur, while increasing your shutter will reduce it. Can you explain how should I go about editing different frame rates in one timeline? So like mixing 24 with 30 or 60 or 120 frames per second in one video? Yes, I can. Let's jump into Final Cut Pro here. I have a folder. I recorded files at 24, 50, 60, 120 and 240 frames per second. I'm gonna grab them all and then drop them onto a timeline. This is what they look like when you drop them into a timeline. At 24 frames per second, 50, they just look normal, and then 60. You can tell the difference is a little bit smoother, but it's just plays back normal. And when you come to 120 frames per second, it plays back in slow motion. Just like 240 frames per second, it plays back in slow motion as well. So again, here we have the 24 frames per second, and then we're going on the 50 frames per second, and we can actually slow it down to 48% of its original speed, and that will give us exactly
24 frames at half a speed. Another way to get half a speed is if you have a 60 frame per second clip and you slow it down to 40% of its original speed. It'll be exactly the same thing, playing back at 24 frame per second at half a speed. And one thing to mention here, the higher the frame rate you're shooting, the more light you need. So you either need to increase the ISO or you need to increase the light source. And if the actual slow motion clips are too slow for you, then you can just speed it up. This is the 120 frames per second, speed it up to 130% of its original speed, and it plays back like this. Well, that's pretty much it. I hope it was helpful, and thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.
Wow, man, thanks. I understand absolutely everything about frame rates now. Thank you so much. Good man yourself. Cheers.